So today's topic is Hashimoto's and hypothyroidism, hypothyroiditis. Hashimoto's and hypothyroidism are stress and emotional traumas triggers. I'm Dr. Martin Rutherford. I am a certified functional medicine practitioner and a chiropractor.
Dr. Randall Gates, board certified chiropractic neurologist, also a chiropractor.
Okay, and for those of you who have not joined us, we do a series every week on basically on chronic pain, chronic conditions. Dr. Gates' discipline is brain related, brain function related. If you've heard about brain exercises and rehab exercises, I would argue that his discipline and his mentor is a large reason as to why you have heard about those things. And I'm part of the functional medicine world. Dr. Gates is also now. And you know, we kind of worked without the brain as a consideration when we were working with autoimmunities and thyroid problems and gut problems and leaky guts and all that. And we started to realize that the two of them needed to kind of mesh if we really wanted to start getting some real consistently excellent results with a lot of these very complex cases. And indeed, that is the case. Hashimoto's is something that my mentor, Dr. Karazian, really is, I think I give him credit for people even talking about it today. He was the one who really pushed it onto the forefront. And at the time, it was kind of made fun of as a diagnosis. And over the past several years, had the opportunity to go from consulting with patients going from, yeah, Hashimoto's is real. And yes, I know your endocrinologist is making fun of me. And I know these types of things to now, I think Hashimoto's is widely embraced as a diagnosis. I don't think that but I don't think the understanding of how to address it is yet getting out there into the general population of doctors. And there's a lot of different theories on it in the alternative world. But the bottom line is that it's a complex condition. And I think we have a pretty good feel for it because one of the things that we had to come to understand to deal with chronic pain was Hashimoto's. My mentor and Dr. Gates have done like an enormous amount of research on this. And it turns out that Hashimoto's is kind of like the canary in the coal mine. It's just like blowing up as far as the understanding of how it's connected to so many different other conditions, which I'm not going to get into. But over the years, we've now come to realize what causes it. Viruses cause it, chronic stress hormones cause it, gluten, the still controversial gluten causes it. But what causes it and what sets it off are kind of two different things. Mm-hmm. One or two particularly related, but others trigger it. And there are several triggers. But we're going to talk about the trigger that I think we see the most today. And I think it's the one that people cognite on the most, which is stress, and even more so emotional traumas. And Dr. Gates is going to delineate for you the differences between stress and emotional trauma and the devastating effects of emotional trauma, and how it sets off Hashimoto's, which sets off another whole cascade of things, which you can see in our other presentations on Hashimoto's thyroiditis. So probably a little thing on Hashimoto's, but definitely what are, is stress and emotional traumas that triggered? The answer is yes. and you're about to find out why. So.
And yeah, just to go through Hashimoto's briefly and hypothyroidism. Hypothyroidism is where your thyroid is low, just talking about the hormones because we may reference this. TSH is the common hormone used to check the thyroid. TSH has an inverse relationship to thyroid function. So if your TSH goes up, that means that your thyroid is low. And vice versa, if your TSH is down, that means your thyroid is high. The thyroid makes an active thyroid hormone, which is T4, that circulates throughout your body to become active thyroid hormone for the most part. That's T3. Most of that conversion happens in your intestines and your liver. Now, with that being said, estimates vary from 70 to 95%. LabCorp says 95% of the time when someone has hypothyroidism, it's because their immune system is killing the thyroid. And this can be tracked through the thyroid peroxidase antibody as well as the thyroglobulin antibody. But keep in mind, there's also an entity called seronegative Hashimoto's, which is where you can have negative antibodies, but you still have Hashimoto's because the immune system response can be sometimes just primarily T cell mediated versus a B cell mediated response. B cells make antibodies. So hopefully that all fits. Now, with that being said, the question is, why do people have Hashimoto's, as Dr. Rutherford was alluding to? New research came out regarding the connection between gluten and Hashimoto's in 2008. That was when the the EPIC study came out in the journal Thyroid. And then other studies started coming out in 2012 regarding viruses, because doctors were observing that patients would have like cold sores and then they would get Hashimoto's. And so they found human herpes virus 6 in about 80% of Hashimoto's patients. And when they went in, they took fluid out of the thyroid of people who didn't have Hashimoto's, they found hardly any viruses. And more research has been done on this matter, and they've since found Epstein-Barr virus in about 80% of Hashimoto's patients, Vibrio viruses as well, and there are probably other viruses too. Now, when you look online about the causes of Hashimoto's, you'll see a lot of discussion about genetics, and certainly genetics can play a factor. Like in your family, several members had thyroid problems, and you developed a thyroid problem. So genetics certainly is at play. Possibly some of those genetics are relating to not only gluten reactions, but how the body combats viruses like Epstein-Barr virus. But genetics is not all of it, because what we're seeing is an explosion in Hashimoto's. Now, where some estimates are saying upwards of 1 out of 3 females now have Hashimoto's. A lot of the variance you're going to see in the statistics is based on what laboratory criteria is being used. There's not a uniform set standard between research groups or hospitals or independent lab facilities on what constitutes Hashimoto's and what doesn't constitute Hashimoto's. And it varies from continent to continent. To give you the backstory, when about 8 years ago when we started doing this, a lot of the labs were saying the high value for the thyroid peroxidase antibody is anything over 100. Then it switched down to 60. Then it went to 50. LabCorp is still saying 34. Mayo Clinic is saying 9. Our local hospital is saying 9. A majority of the labs we've seen in California, because we have a lot of patients who come up from California to Reno to get treated, say 9, but not all of them do. But we've seen 9 as a common reference range. We have patients coming from Europe where they're saying anything over 5 is too high, or 6 is too high, or 5.5. And it's the same unit of measurement. So just know this is very similar to cholesterol, when the cholesterol level used to be 300 or 270 as being too high. And now they're bringing it down to 200 and possibly even lower. Just there's no agreement on what constitutes Hashimoto's, but we go off the Mayo Clinic criteria. So that's the current evidence right now. Now, the discussion about stress, the relationship in the literature in terms of accepting how stress can affect the thyroid is more in favor of hyperthyroidism. And just to beg the question, how could stress cause an autoimmune response to the thyroid? Well, when you're stressed, your immune system can get imbalanced. That's well documented. So just think you have a military, and within the military, you have the Marine Corps and you have the Air Force. Well, the Marine Corps does different things than the Air Force, and that's how your immune system kind of works. And within the Marine Corps, you have a bunch of little messengers, and the Air Force, you have the same thing. Well, what they see is that when people are under stress, you can get a shift in the dominance of one side of your military, so to speak, being your immune system. Also, when you're stressed, your intestines can break down in terms of the barrier integrity. And given the relationship between what they've found with gluten, such that if gluten gets through your intestines, the immune cells to the gluten can actually start to attack the thyroid. That's the current concept. Well, if your intestines are breaking down, potentially that's leading to more food molecules getting through, your immune system attacking those, and then your thyroid getting attacked. Keep in mind, a lot of people, when we broach the issue of stress, as you have done so often, because Dr. Rutherford does the initial consultations where he'll spend 30 minutes to an hour with the patient. And so often patients will tell him, I'm not stressed. I'm not stressed. And this
I had
is
one yesterday.
and this is a different type of stress we're talking about. We're talking about chronic fight-flight responses. And you may not think that you're stressed, but so frequently when we do the examination, we find that people are in this chronic state of fight or flight. If you've been exposed to trauma in childhood, you have a much increased probability of this happening. And that trauma could be physical, sexual, verbal abuse, could be seeing, your parent die, it could be growing up with an alcoholic parent. Other traumas that we see all the time include surgeries, because when people go through surgeries, yes, the anesthesia is there to block your brain from feeling the pain, but cortisol levels can still go up dramatically when you're cutting through body tissue. So we've seen that trigger Hashimoto so often. And in the literature, the way they phrase this is that they say they see the relationship between stress and hypothyroidism or Hashimoto's, but they don't know the clear mechanism. Now, in the research world, they're not going to say anything until they're 100% certain that they know the mechanism. But understanding the physiology of it and understanding what we just laid out to you, you're meant to be stressed for 20 minutes. You're not meant to be stressed for 20 years. And in our society, we're not a relaxed population for the most part at this point. Most people are going morning till night. I just saw a thing on Facebook where mothers work on average 96 to over 100 hours a week when you're factoring in everything they're doing around the house. To most of them are working full-time jobs. I bring that up because most patients with Hashimoto's are females. And so there is a female preponderance of the condition. So all that's very, very important. And stress, we have found definitively to be an associated factor with our Hashimoto's patients. And likely you're going to see more and more evidence come out in this or on this in the literature in the years to come. What did you want to add to that?
No, I was listening to you. Delineation, you feel like you delineated clearly between the emotional trauma and the stress. Like the emotional trauma is kind of like the on button is in your head. Dr. Gates said you're only supposed to be stressed for like 20 minutes. But when there's emotional trauma, the fear center in your brain
gets hyperactivated.
Did I miss that?
I didn't really go through that.
Yeah, okay. And the people and the patients kind of relate to that. It's like there's a fear center in your brain that gets activated, and if it's just a general fear, again, I want to bring this into some practicality. If it's just a general fear or a general anger, it tends to dissipate after the problem is gone. If you've been to alternative practitioners and you're out there saying, "Oh, they're taking care of that, they're giving me adaptocrines," are they really working? If they are, then you don't have this fight-flight mechanism going on, because that it's a whole different mechanism. And this mechanism, that fear center, gets triggered. And it's like this is not in the literature. Okay, I'm not the literature guy. It's almost like my perception of it is it's almost like the brain. It's such a trauma, and the fear center kind of rules the emotional. It's called the limbic system. Is that correct? I'm not the brain guy either. Okay, so but it's almost kind of like my perception of like that brain. It's your survival mechanism. This is your survival mechanism we're talking about. This is the old look. I'm walking through the woods and there's some bushes rattling over there. Is that a lion that I need to run from or I need to fight? So this is like our ultimate survival mechanism, which is why it's only designed for 20 minutes. But when you get this emotional trauma, and I don't know if this is a new development of mankind or what, it's almost like your brain is telling you to never forget that. Never forget that happened, because it was so devastating to your brain and then it just stays. And as Dr. Gates would explain, that part of the brain actually, that fear center actually
can
enlarges, and then it imposes upon other parts of the brain, memory and stuff like that. And the point is that I try to make the patients is, I understand that you may be living the dream right now, but your physiology is saying that your brain is still going nonstop from when you had that trauma when you were a kid. And we see it all the time, and it's not.
We see it all the time, and yeah, this is important because, as Dr. Rutherford is saying, when people are exposed to trauma, especially in childhood, your frontal lobes are not developed yet. The frontal lobes are meant to keep the fear center in check. So now you take a little individual, you expose them to trauma or some horrific circumstance, and now this fear center is turned on like a max sound, so to speak. The frontal lobes can't shut it off. The fear center then fires to the adrenal glands make cortisol and adrenaline, the cortisol feeds back and further damages frontal lobe neurons as well as neurons in your memory area, so that, just so you know, the fear center and the memory area are like a ham sandwich, so they're right on top of each other. So now as the cortisol goes up, the memory center actually starts to shrink, and then the fear center can actually take over neurological real estate right where the memory center is located. And we have even seen patients who've been through such horrific circumstances that they actually can't remember the circumstances, and through going through counseling, then they actually start to remember events because the trauma was so horrific that it actually shut off their memory center so much that they can't even remember. Now that's more the exception, but the rule is typically patients have been through lots of trauma, and then this whole mechanism gets set into play. And this is important. We've talked about it relative to other broadcasts, because trauma in childhood, usually emotional, physical, sexual, like we're talking about, predisposes people to irritable bowel syndrome, depression.
You just said the word I was going to say. And this emotional trauma can not only be a trigger, but it can be the predisposing factor that causes you to be more vulnerable to developing something else. Like for me, I was under a lot of stress. I got pneumonia, and the next thing you know, I developed Hashimoto's and a number of other things.
Right.
And so it's like a two-edged sword.
It really is. Depression, anxiety, irritable bowel syndrome, chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia. We're talking about Hashimoto's today. They just did a study this year in February 2017 where they took a group of Hashimoto's patients and they said, how many of you have fibromyalgia? 62% had fibromyalgia. And then when you look at the statistics on fibromyalgia and trauma in childhood, there's a huge correlation there. So we're bringing this out because probably you're going to hear about this in the future. Again, the whole discussion on Hashimoto's is really only about 10 years old at this level. And so you're probably going to hear about this more going into the future about this connection, but we're just bringing it to you. And the way we titled this broadcast, or at least the little blurb I wrote, I said we were going to talk about our clinical experience because we frequently see trauma as a precipitating factor for Hashimoto's thyroiditis, even when there's a genetic component, or the person's eating gluten and all this other stuff, but the stress lots of times can be the tipping point.
Yeah, for those of you who say, well, you guys didn't tell us how to fix it. Okay. I mean, Xanax is what, the number 2, or these types of drugs are number 2 most common drugs in the country. So I mean, there's already that approach. If you're taking those medications, this is why. All right, usually this is why. But there are non-drug approach, but it's so individualized between doing rehabilitation to the brain, particularly the frontal lobe, and then finding out all the other things that are flaring up responses. But one of the things that have to be brought down in our world to be able to help people have autoimmune problems is this chronic fight-flight syndrome. And this is what Dr. Gay, this is not a sales pitch, just for the people who say, you don't tell us how to do this. Okay, but your whole discipline is, the whole functional neurology discipline is created around stopping this mechanism, or at least a big part of that discipline. Stop without medications and without drugs and stuff like that. So, but it's so individualized. We can't tell you how to do this online. So you can look up functional neurology. You can, I don't know what you can look up.
Yeah, and I think maybe taking them through the 3 different paradigms. So, okay, so if you're saying, if you're acknowledging, okay, I've had trauma, I have Hashimoto's, the medical paradigm is you go to your GP, or you see a psychiatrist and they evaluate you for depression or anxiety, or they say, okay, maybe you need to be referred for psychotherapy, so you go see a psychologist. That's that world. The alternative medical model is what Dr. Rutherford alluded to. They give you adaptocrines. So they give you adaptogenic herbs to shut off your stress response. Theanine, ashwagandha, holy basil, things like this to help calm things down. They give you GABA, or they give you phenibut. And then in the functional neurology, functional medicine world, it's really getting to the cause of the problem, which primarily involves frontal lobe exercises, but we work in an integrated fashion to where if one of our patients has been through horrible abuse and that pattern is not changing, we'll refer them to a psychiatrist who understands functional medicine. We'll refer them to a hypnotherapist. We'll refer them to a psychologist. We make those referrals because these issues have to be dealt with in our experience for a person to get better long term.
Yeah, and that makes the exercises more powerful. Yeah.
Okay.
So I mean, that's the general thing, the general approach for dealing with it, but it's a big deal. And I would say it's one of our 4 major breakthroughs And if you've been watching us for years, you might notice that we've morphed more towards putting a lot of emphasis on the neurological aspects of these problems. And for example, today they're calling irritable bowel syndrome irritable brain syndrome. You're going to see a lot more of that, okay? And this is kind of why we're doing these presentations. So.
Yeah, so if you want some of the articles on this, you can go to powerhealthtalk.com. The articles we have for today are below. Some of the articles were on oxidative stress, things like that, so I attached those. You can also find our other broadcasts on Hashimoto's, hypothyroidism. We probably have quite a few at this point, I think upwards of 10, where we really try to cover all these points. We're going to have a Cutting Through the BS series that we're filming this Thursday on Hashimoto's. So we hope you find this information helpful, and we'll see you next week.